Hello, welcome back to Andertons TV. My name is Oz and I'm here with...
Chris. I am from Moog Music.
And this is...
the Moog Muse.
This thing looks like a freaking spaceship. Chris is going to give us a rundown of this thing and tell you guys out there everything about it. But before we get into this, please check the links below for anything we miss out or Chris potentially misses out, hopefully not. We're also going to do a little bit of a playing only video as well, so if you just want to hear some presets and some rad noises from this thing, you shall have that soon. But for now, let's get into it. Please like and subscribe. Bye!
Like and subscribe. Hello, I am Chris from Moog Music. I am on the product development team at Moog, and here we are showing off the new Moog Muse, which is an 8-voice analog polyphonic Bi-Timbral synthesizer. First thing to note about Muse is that we really designed it for touring and gigging musicians and for players. So right off the bat, it's built-in rugged sheet metal with chunky wood sides, so this thing really takes to the road very nicely. And for players, we have a 61 key bed with velocity and channel aftertouch, as well as other performance features, left-hand controller, sustain and expression pedal inputs. And then we also have a lot of little hidden performance features around the panel of Muse, which I'll touch on over the course of this video. One of those being this macro knob, which will take the sound of a preset and apply anything from subtle modulation to really extreme patch morphing. So for example, if I, in this patch, raise the macro knob, in this case, raising the macro knob sharpens up the filters a bit, folds in another oscillator, does a couple of things to morph the sound. Muse is a bi-timbral instrument, which means that every patch has two timbres, which you can think of as every patch having two separate patches, two completely separate panel settings that you can allocate Muse's 8 voices to. For this patch, we have all 8 voices allocated to this timbre. So we can play 8 voices in this timbre, but we also can switch to timbre B, which has 8 voices now for timbre B, which is a complementary sound to timbre A. So every patch you can have different ways of using the bitimbrality, and in this case the macro knob does something different. This is kind of a more electro-piano version of the timbre A, and by increasing the macro knob, we, add in a little attack, kind of change the sound a little bit. We could also do more typical bitimbral things with Muse, such as stacking the voices or splitting them. I'll pull up a split patch here, where in the left I have a bass patch, and in the right, chords. And what's nice is for this patch, for example, since the macro knob is totally configurable, it'll do different things. So I can as the macro knob is kind of beefing up the bass, lengthening the decay and release on the envelopes, opening the filters a bit, it's also folding in a second oscillator on the B timbre. So there's a lot of interesting ways you can use the bitimbrality, and we have 2 banks on Muse of split patches, set up in that way for really immediate patches for performance. About the presets on Muse, we have 16 banks of 16 presets each. Each Muse ships with 14 of those banks full, and the banks are structured such as, like I said, 2 splits banks. We have a bass bank, lead bank, plucks, medals, the oddities bank for all the weird sounds. And we left the last 2 banks as user banks for you to start making your own patches. Muse can hook up with your computer over USB to take patches off of Muse, load patches on, so it's a very flexible instrument and has lots of presets there for you. So to get into a bit of the analog guts of Muse, like I said, it's an 8-voice analog synthesizer, so to go over kind of how those analog voice cards are structured, I'll pull up a patch here. We start with 2 oscillators. And those oscillators, the core of those oscillators are coming from the Mini Moog Voyager. That's where their circuits are derived from. But we changed the wave shaping a little bit, so you have 3 controls for the wave shape. On the left here, you have a triangle to saw shape, and then you can mix that with the wave mix with a square wave. And that square wave then has pulse width. So you can get really interesting wave shapes out of the oscillators on themselves, and especially since all these controls are modulatable, you can really get really interesting sounds. We also have, we can bring in the second oscillator. To thicken up the sound. And we also have really interesting FM on this synth. Basically, you can route FM going from oscillator 2 to 1 or 1 to 2 with the FM amount knob. But you can also go into the More menu for each oscillator and edit the depth of modulation possible in each direction. Every module on Muse has a More menu in the top right of the module with this little triangular button, which gives you access to a further list of parameters and settings for that module, which is really handy. You kind of know if you need to change something, you know where to go on Muse, and it really brings a lot of power to the synth and makes sound design very quick. But with this FM, we can get really interesting analog FM sounds. Sounds that you really wouldn't expect from an analog synth, but that's just because of the power of the analog FM engine on Muse and the deep configurability of it. You can get really unexpected sounds. Each voice has a third voltage-controlled oscillator per voice called the modulation oscillator. And the modulation oscillator can be used in low frequencies or audio frequencies. So, and it has a bunch of pre-routed modulation destinations. So for example, I can route it to filter 2 and raise the modulation oscillator to modulate filter 2. And because you have a separate VCO, a separate modulation VCO for every voice, when I have 2 notes, you get really pleasing polyphonic modulation where those voltage-controlled oscillators are not going to be, they're always going to be kind of going out of phase with each other, which gets you that really nice poly mod. I can also set the modulation oscillator to audio rate, have it track the keyboard. And in this case, I have a sine wave that I can route to the mixer as well and mix with the other oscillators. So by adding a really beefy low-end oscillator like that, I can really add a bunch of low-end to my sound, but also just having a nice sine wave on its own and then clipping it in the mixer. that's just a sine wave being clipped in the mixer. So the mixer is based on the Moog CP3 mixer from the 1960s, a mixer design we use on other instruments such as the Mini Moog Model D, the Matriarch. But where those instruments, you know, the famous thing about the mixer is that it saturates when you push the level of any channel above noon. You don't always necessarily want that on a polyphonic synth. That can get a little messy very quickly. So we reimagined the mixer a bit and gave you the mixer where you can raise the channel all the way for a clean mix, and then you have this overload slider to overload the entire mix. Which can be really, really nice. In the mixer you also have ring mod between the oscillators 1 and 2, and a white noise generator. And so the output of the mixer goes into 2 filters, Moog discrete transistor ladder filters. Filter 1 can be configured to be high pass, and filter 2 is always a dedicated low pass filter. Less said about the filters, the better. It's just better to hear them. The filters can be, there are a couple configuration routings. You can route them in series or parallel, which depending on how you configure filter 1 can give you bandpass and notch filters, or they can be in stereo for stereo low pass filtering. We then have 2 envelope generators per voice. They're ADSR envelopes with looping and velocity sensitivity. And you can go into the envelopes and configure the amount of velocity, so how dramatic the velocity effect is, as well as the way the velocity responds to your playing. And you can also configure things like the envelope shapes. For every timing stage, you can configure the shapes to be logarithmic, exponential, linear. So they're really, really programmable envelopes. And those envelopes can be assigned to modulate anything else in Muse, but by default, one of them is for filter modulation, and the other one is for modulation of the VCAs of the amplifiers. Which brings us to the last part of the analog voice cards, which is the VCA section. These are stereo discrete VCAs based on the Moog 902 VCAs from the old Moog modular systems, but now in stereo. Yeah, the VCAs are controlled by the VCA envelope, and you can set the level per timbre, which is really nice if you're if you have a stack patch or something to mix your 2 timbres together. And you can also pan the timbres, and then we also have pan spread. So as you raise pan spread, all of the 8 voices will be panned in the stereo field. And you can go into the VCA More menu, and there are a lot of configuration options for how that pan spread behavior happens. The 8 voices are then summed and sent to the diffusion delay, which is a very interesting effect that we've worked quite hard on. It's modeled after some of the vintage digital delay rack units from the 70s and 80s, but we added a bunch of interesting things in there that allow you to do kind of diffuse tonal smears and filtered echoes and things like that. I'll bring up this patch which I think shows off the delay quite well. We're calling it a diffusion delay because you can add in a diffusion network of all-pass filters in the feedback path. Which start to smear your sound as it travels through the feedback path and gets repeated over and over. The delay has time controls for left and right. Those can be linked together if you want. And they can also be synced to your master clock. You have feedback and dry wet mix. And you can also allocate timbre A and timbre B to the delay. And you can also bypass those timbres. You can bypass the delay entirely if you want to preserve a fully complete analog signal at the output. We also have this character knob, and in the More menu you can configure all sorts of things about the delay and all sorts of things about this character knob, such as filtering. Right now it's above noon will cut the lows and boost the highs, and below noon it'll cut the highs and boost the lows. It's a tilt EQ. And it's also folding in more diffuse behavior. And you can also fold in multi-tap behavior on the character knob as well, folding in 4 separate taps. Kind of the way you would on a Roland Space Echo or something like that. So that is the diffusion delay. We like to think of it as an instrument in its own right. You can really get lost in playing it. For modulation on Muse, we have a bunch of modulation sources. We have the 2 envelopes, like I mentioned. We also have the assignable controllers section. So let's say I pull up a patch. Let's pull up. Or the Bi-Timbral on this one. With every patch on Muse, there's a lot to explore with the bitimbrality and the macro knobs. Let's say I like this patch. I do like this patch, but let's say I want to use this patch. Let's say in this patch I want to use Aftertouch to open the filter. What I do is I just press the Aftertouch button in the assignable controllers section, and now it's just waiting for me to move a knob to assign the Aftertouch to. So I'll move the filter to cutoff. I'll just turn it all the way up, but I can set the modulation depth with the knob here. I'll just turn it all the way up and press enter, and now Aftertouch is going to open the filter. Which in this case reveals these waves in this patch. If I go to the mod map, I can see in the most recent mod slot the routing I just made, Aftertouch to the filter. And let's say, you know, sometimes I'm not the best player in the world. When I use Aftertouch, it can be a little too quick for my taste. I like to smooth it out a bit. So what I can do is I can add slew to that modulation by going over to the function here, putting on slew, and turning up the slew to, I don't know, yeah, 23.72 sounds exactly right. And that way when I apply Aftertouch, it'll ramp up a little longer and ramp down a little longer. So you can apply these functions to all of your modulation routings. There's a bunch of mathematical functions in there, exponential transforms, comparators, all sorts of interesting things to bring the mod map to life. And for every patch, you have 16 mod slots per timbre. So some of the other modulation routings, of course, any of the assignable controllers, you know, things like expression pedal, velocity, the keyboard itself, the macro knob. But you can also use one of the 3 LFOs we have here, which are pretty interesting. LFOs 1 and 2 are identical, and they can both be global or per timbre, or per voice rather. So they can either be, you know, a global LFO or 8 copies of that LFO per voice. These LFOs have choosable wave shapes. If you go to the 5th wave shape and go to the More menu of the LFO, you can choose what we're calling the user wave, which lives in this fifth wave shape here. And there are all sorts of very strange waveforms that everyone on the engineering team at Moog chose, and you can find images of those in the manual. They're very fun little strange waveforms you can use. Other things about the LFO section, you can change the rate knob. You can set a minimum and maximum amount for the rate knob of the LFO per patch, which is a really useful performance tool. Let's say you have a patch that you use in one song and you want to limit the rate knob of the LFO to go from one rate to another. You can do that so that for every patch you pull up, the rate knob is exactly what you want for that sound. And there's also an amplitude control for the two LFOs, which means that, let's say I had this LFO modulating a bunch of things. It's modulating the filter in a pretty, extreme to a pretty extreme amount. It's modulating the oscillator in a very, very subtle amount, and maybe it's modulating, I don't know, the filter envelope decay quite heavily. This amplitude will scale the LFO at the source. So that can be really helpful because you have this kind of global macro knob to control the strength of the LFO to all of its mapped destinations. The third LFO is the pitch LFO, which is a bit different from the other two. Has a rate knob, but also has a shape knob. So it's a skewing LFO where you can skew the shape from sawtooth through triangle to a ramp wave. And you can route the pitch LFO to your two oscillators, your modulation oscillator, and also the global detune control, which when the detune's all the way down, the tuning is tight on Muse, and you raise it and the tuning gets a bit looser, let's say. But the pitch LFO is really nice. I have the mod wheel right now mapped to fold in the pitch LFO. But the pitch LFO amount is scaled to about 2 semitones. You can really dial in the amount of vibrato you want. I mean, we designed it to be the best LFO we could for vibrato duties. So it doesn't get too extreme. Sometimes you have to be very sensitive with the mod wheel with vibrato, but with the pitch LFO we made it so that you're always getting really nice vibratos. And we also have things like envelope mode on the pitch LFO. If I pull up this patch, for example, this basically makes the pitch LFO kind of a one-shot. So with this patch, the pitch LFO is making the oscillators sag for a bit and then come back up. And I can adjust the amount of that sag. Moving on, we also have an arpeggiator and a sequencer on Muse. I'll start with the arpeggiator. The arpeggiator is it's an arpeggiator, so I'm going to hold down a chord. It's an arpeggiator, but there's a whole lot more than meets the eye with this arpeggiator. I can enable things like pendulum motion. I can change the direction and the octave range of the arpeggiator, sure. But if I go to the Art menu here, you'll see that as the arpeggiator advances, I can program a rhythm and program rests. So you can actually start programming deeper compositions with the arpeggiator. You can turn down the gate probability. Turn it to 70%, then it's going to drop about 30% of the notes that should be on. If I enable all of them, then it's going to drop about 30% of these notes. And you can do all sorts of other things. Change the length of those rhythms from 1 to 64 steps, adjust the gate length, all sorts of deeper programming with the arpeggiator. And also in the arpeggiator More menu, you can add swing to the arpeggiator motion. You can enable things like leapfrog behavior, where the arpeggiator jumps up a few notes and then jumps back a different number of notes, and get really weird patterns with the arpeggiator. You can engage serialism mode, which will apply, 20th century serialist compositional techniques to the arpeggiator and restrict it to only repeat a note once it's played all the other ones. Also, the arpeggiator is saved per timbre, so you can do nice things. If I pull up this patch, I have the arpeggiator in the bass. So you can, get immediate Italo disco type things going if you want. Being able to save that arpeggiator per timbre is a really, really nice performance tool where you can pull up a preset and just immediately be ready to go. We also have chord memory, so I can, for example, take my B timbre here, learn a chord, save that, and turn on chord memory. So that whenever I press a key, it's gonna play that chord shape with whatever key I press as the root note. And I can also turn on key mode in chord memory, where if I press learn, play a chord, I can now assign that chord to a specific key. So now when I turn chord memory on, these notes are normal, but that note is playing the chord. So I can totally remap the keyboard of Muse to play different chords. I can also remap the keyboard however I want. I can remap the white keys to be C minor if I want. And with a flick of a switch, change the white keys from C major to C minor. I don't know. There are all sorts of possibilities you can do with key mode and the chord memory on Muse. But also, if I have chord memory on, let's just have it in normal mode and turn the arpeggiator on. It's arpeggiating chords instead of notes. So very, very powerful compositional tool there, which brings me to the other very, very powerful compositional tool on Muse, which is the sequencer. I'll press the sequence button here in the programmer and bring up my sequencer view, which I have 16 sequences here. Muse has 16 banks of 16 sequences, and it ships with a sequence for every patch on Muse. If I pull up this patch, for example, it's going to pull up the associated patch, the low pass gate poly patch, which is really nice. So I can play this sequence. But I can also switch to any other patch I like and audition patches to see if they work. So this patch I actually like better with that sequence. Now I can go in and show you how to record a new sequence. If I just start a new sequence here, the sequence is very easy to use. I'll press record and just start entering notes. As I enter a note, it's going to advance to the next step. I can press advance to put in some rests, and I can play chords. And now listen back to what that sequence was. The sequencer has its own clock division knob, as does the arpeggiator, so they can both run at different divisions of the master clock on Muse. Master clock on Muse you can set with either the master clock with this tempo knob, or can come in through USB MIDI, normal 5-pin DIN MIDI, or analog clock. Muse also has, I forgot to mention, CV inputs and outputs, analog clock in and out, so it's fully ready to be the centerpiece of a modern studio. But back to the sequencer. I can also overdub onto this sequence. So if I hold shift and press record, that just overdubs those notes onto the sequencer. If I don't like what I did, I can just hold in it and press record, and that's going to undo whatever I did since the last time record was on. So now if I play the sequence, it's the sequence how it was before I did that overdubbing, and I can try again. So the sequencer is really fast to use, really easy to get down musical ideas, you know, overdub things, really quick to start building up entire compositions. You can also go into the step view and, for example, every step of the sequence is highly editable with Muse. I can scroll over to the note page to change these notes, transpose them. I can go to the gate length stage and set gate lengths for every individual note on each step. Velocity. I can also set timing. Muse can either be basically unquantized, or you can choose to quantize it very strictly to the grid, and you can offset the timing of your notes in this sort of micro timing of each step. And also timbre allocation. There's probabilistic, all sorts of probabilistic functions in the sequencer, all sorts of things built in there. But yeah, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Every more menu on Muse has lots of hidden things that I haven't been able to talk about. The sequencer is super deep, full of little nooks and crannies to explore. And yeah, we think you're really gonna like Muse. So if you want to know a little bit more about Muse, check the links in the description below. Muse is available from Andertons right now. And thanks for watching. I am Chris from Moog. And yeah, this has been Andertons TV. Like and subscribe to Andertons TV. Thanks a lot. Woo!